So welcome to this podcast chat. I'm chatting with Tom, and Tom's been a great guy that's worked with me over the last 6 or 7 months on helping me build my content and marketing strategy around Build Invisible. And over almost 2 hours, actually, it was almost in the end, we chatted about a large variety of topics around the book and about life. I had a great chat, or a great chance to answer some of the questions and actually hear a lot from Tom on his experiences, and also thinking about his key takeaways from the book as well. Tom, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think that one of the interesting points that we've had in this discussion is looking at the content from the book in your experiences, and then sort of applying that to where I'm at the moment. Very early on in my stages of pursuing a career in the sports industry. I think it's been interesting to sort of compare both insights. It's been a great conversation, and hopefully it can be found useful.
All right, Tom. So I'll start off by asking you a couple of questions as to how we got into this space now, doing this conversation today. But how did we get to know each other?
So, funny story that I'd say probably started about 12, 18 months ago.
Okay.
So when I was first exploring a future within the sports industry, unsurprisingly, a lot of your content was coming up because of the great resources out there. And learning all this stuff, I eventually wanted to meet you in person. And an opportunity there was to attend the Football and Agent Business Summit in November of last year. And unsurprisingly, I'd taken a lot of your advice on board and had prepared what I wanted to say to you when we first met.
Okay.
And
How did it go?
Well, yeah. Well, we're going to get onto this now. So I practiced what I was going to say. I was ready to impress you. Anyway, so on the morning of the event, rock up, get to the networking event, and we first meet in the bathroom.
I didn't think it was going to go there.
Yeah. So I was quite surprised by this, because I was meeting you for the first time, and it was as you were coming out of the bathroom and I was going in. So that was I think an interesting way to start off our relationship. I'd like to say it all went positively from there. Later on in the summit, I think I just sort of approached you. We had a brief chat about some of the things that I'd really found beneficial from the content that you'd been producing. And one thing really led to another. I think I offered if there were any projects that I'd be able to help you out on, because I really wanted to, even if not in sort of a legal environment, just sort of do some work with you, see how you go about things. So I think that's one of the big things that I found is from working alongside people, learning how they operate, you can pick up quite a lot. And then you mentioned the book coming out and wanting a bit of support with sort of the digital marketing side of things and social media. And I remember the point that I sort of brought up with you. It was an example of someone that we knew was doing very good work, Joe Pompliano in the Huddle.
Yep.
Who's basically a content producer and is really good about producing long-form content that he chops up and manages to market really well. And I remember in this 5-10 minute conversation that we initially had, I was able to bring in this example. It was something that we could discuss and even look in the moment at some of the content he was doing and think about how this could be applicable for your work. And one thing really led to another from that point. I think we sort of stayed in contact, and I sort of helped you out on a couple of different tasks. That sort of brought us to where we are today.
It really did.
Yeah.
I remember us having the first conversation.
What was your side of things?
I just remember a really tall person coming up to speak to me, and doing some of the things we're going to talk about, in our conversation now, which was, compliments are always nice. And I remember early saying how much you really appreciated all the stuff that I'd put out there. I remember then you saying, there's lots of different things I could potentially help you with. and could we have a bit of a longer conversation at some point to talk through some of the things and give you some ideas? Because I think ultimately what's always really helpful at the beginning is you don't need to be best friends with the person straight away. You just need to be able to demonstrate to the other person that you're looking to try and build the relationship with, that you're competent, you're good, you can say something interesting, and then follow up with a good piece of written work. I think that's what it is, or some type of competence in whichever field you are. And that's what happened when you sent over that Joe note with all the various different elements to it. And that's really when I was like, this is actually a really good note. Let's see how we can incorporate some of these things into the Build Invisible stuff that we're going to talk about. And that's actually where it went from, really, which was, an initial conversation to productivity as a result, to putting a lot of time, obviously, into a note which looked really good and contained lots and lots of interesting information, to then working out how I could end up doing something. So that was the start position.
Yeah, and I think that leads on to quite a nice point. And one of the messages that I know you reinforce, and it comes through a lot through the book, is when you're given the opportunity to over-deliver as much as possible on a task. Because I think one of the crucial things is making that really good first impression. And I knew that this piece of work that I was going to be sending you, it was your first impression of what I'm capable of. And for me to be able to present a very polished, informative document, I thought was very important. I think that's something I was aware of when I was putting it together, knowing that really investing my time into it, producing something that I thought would be beneficial to you, would be a good place to start.
Yep. Well, do we want to start? Or you tell me where we're going to start, because I think one of the things that in the very good sets of notes that you provided for for our chat, 10 pages of notes, no doubt, was one of the fundamentals of the book is getting to yes. No, we can talk about that in a bit more, and I'm sure you want to talk about a few other things beforehand, but let's hold that getting to yes, because I think that was for me, and from people that have read the versions of the book so far, that was one of the things that they felt was quite an interesting element to consider in a bit more detail.
Throughout the book, you talking about your experiences of getting to where you are today, it ties in a lot of very important stuff. And I think one of the key points here is if we go into sort of the process and what that means for you. I know that you're very open about, for you, your interest in sport started out as a passion, as an interest. And it was while you were advancing your legal career, completely aside from sport, it was the stuff you were doing on the side, purely out of a love for sport. That's sort of how the two paths merged later on. So when you look back on that part of your life, you're sort of trusting in the process, what did that sort of mean for you?
The truth was there was no process in the beginning. When I look back now and and I've written all of these sort of personal stories in the book around lots of different elements, the truth was in the beginning, which I know is the same for you and it'll be the same for lots of people, two things. The first is, for me, it's always been football. For others, it might be a different sport. And for others, it might be a completely different sector, if it's fashion, TV, makeup, film, whatever, esports or otherwise. And so you can substitute my football for any passion area, is the the first thing. But the second thing was I was just doing a lot of the thing I enjoyed doing. And I think it starts off as the usual thing, which is, me as an 1980s child. I know it's obviously different generations, but I was newspapers, radio, and teletext. That was my generation's information sources. Whereas now it's, podcasts, YouTube, and all the internet content, infinite content you could ever wish for in the world. Really, you're never going to have enough time to read everything. Whereas in my day, it wasn't that case. It was looking and finding content. It was in books more than anything else. So I was hungry for information, and it started out hungry for Liverpool Football Club information, and then developed into trying to understand how the business of football worked a little bit more. And I got that through different books on the whole. So there's a great book by David Kahn called The Beautiful Game. That was where it sort of started for me a lot. And then there were a decent amount of football finance books, but not a huge number. And I just devoured all of those, really. So the thing was, in the beginning, I know I was getting very narrow into what I was interested in knowing more about. But actually, the thing was, I was just following my interest. And one of the things we'll talk about a bit later is just sort of finding your flow for things. Now, the counterintuitive thing I'm going to say at the same time is, yes, I didn't really have a process, but I almost did have a subconscious process, which was, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm enjoying doing. So if you want to call that a process, then that's fine, and doing it a little bit obsessively. But the other flip side is that I still had to work out what I was going to do for a job and a career, and actually a structured approach to life. And that was from A levels of I did economics, politics, and English, so I was a writer effectively already. I did law at undergrad, and then I did a master's in sort of sports broadcasting rights. So the thing is that I did know at the same time, as much as I really loved football and sport, I knew it was going to be a long-term project. I hoped it wasn't going to be a long-term project and I'll be able to find the thing I really wanted to do really quickly. Like, I hope I can just apply for a football law role and I'll get a football law role. But that sort of went very pear-shaped very quickly when I applied for those roles and didn't get any of them. So then I had to realize I needed to go a lot broader. And that's one of the things that hopefully comes across in the book, which is play the short and the long-term game well, which is you can do two things at the same time. It's not like you just have to do one thing and do it. And that's the only thing you can do in parallel. And so I was doing quite a few things at the same time. I was trying to build my legal knowledge and then my legal practice skills, whilst at the same time trying to develop particular sector expertise. And it was that process that I started with. And where I'll probably go with that, just very briefly, is what gave me the structure and the process was actually writing blogs, I'd probably say. Because I realized at that point I could write okay, and I could obviously write a lot better, and I've been able to write a lot better over the years, hopefully. But whenever a particular case or interesting matter happened in football that related to the law, the regulations, red card, suspension, or whatever else it might be, I realized there weren't too many people writing about it. Writing about the law, but writing it in an accessible way that enabled people to understand it on my website and on my blog. So the process was actually because there was something interesting going on. No one else was writing about it to the degree that I thought would be useful to write about. So then I was like, I've got to do it. Mm-hmm. So if it's Suarez or Terry or Ferdinand or Anelka or takeovers at Liverpool or third party owned, whatever, all of FFP, all of these things, all of these just football topics. The process was, I think I should write about it because I think it's interesting.
Yeah, and I think leading on from that, one of the things that you talk about as well is understanding the differences and almost the opportunities that you have when you're younger, when you're a student, compared to people that are already in the industry, people that are established at quite senior positions.
Yeah.
And one of the things you talk about there is having time to explore new content, stay up to date with trends that are evolving in the industry. How about you talk a little bit about seeing that as an opportunity and how that can help young people that are trying to break into an industry?
Time. And time is massively undervalued and overvalued. I think when I was a student and then starting out the industry, the truth is that you got so much time on your hands, and you look back and think, "Oh God, I had so much time on my hands," and I definitely wasn't very efficient at using that time as well and as constructively as you and others that I've come across over the last 10 or 15 years. But I think there's probably a few things to consider. I think the first is that all younger people generally have a competitive advantage, and the competitive advantage is time investment. Whereas as I get older, I tend to be more time poor because there's lots of things sort of pulling for my attention. If it's family, if it's work, if it's the stuff I want to do, and if it's all the other things that sort of come along. So the competitive advantage for younger people generally is that idea of thinking, well, what can I positively do with my time? And usually the answer to that is go into that flow state of the stuff that is interesting to you. But the reason why that becomes useful, I think, it's not but, it's an and the reason why it becomes useful, I think, is then you can go and start approaching people and thinking, what can I positively do that will help a time poor person where I am more time rich? So there's two things to this time element. The first is knowledge building and knowledge acquisition, which I'll talk about in a second. And the second is actually, if you've got more time than a person that you want to build a relationship with, how do you make their life a little bit easier, in truth, in the short to medium term? Mm-hmm. And then show competency and showing up and show that you can do all the simple things well and then the difficult things well as a result. But on the knowledge stuff, it's actually it's the most straightforward thing and it's the most difficult thing. It's like the act of beginning, starting off and doing. So that's why I decided to do the Build Invisible book and the journal at the same time, because hopefully the book is a bit of motivation, but motivation for humans, as I've sort of understood and developed, wanes quite quickly, and routine and process is actually the thing that usually sustains people. The habit and the showing up and everything else that comes with it. So on the knowledge acquisition side, I simply think it's, if people are interested in a particular sector, industry, subsector, you've just got to start acquiring knowledge and building up a bank of interesting content that you can access, you can find, you can ingest in a way. Because then at some point, and it doesn't happen very quickly in truth, and that's why a lot of people might not want to do it or get demoralized or disillusioned quite quickly, is it builds into a critical mass. So at some point, which then leads on to the second thing, which is the networking and the relationship building, you can start talking to people inside the industry about particular interesting things that are going on, not because you are bluffing them, not because you are pretending to know what you're talking about, but because you've actually thought in depth and have read in depth about these interesting topics. So one thing nicely leads on to the other, and it leads back to the former. You build knowledge to be able to, for yourself, to be able to have a better understanding of the industry. You then can build relationships with people who are more time poor, you're time rich. And then as a result of showing that competency, you can demonstrate actually you know more about the industry and surprise them from what they might otherwise think, because you're investing in yourself and then investing in the relationships. Very long way of saying a very straightforward thing. So,
no, very well put. And I think that from my experience especially, I had almost a sense of realization when that first sort of connection that I made in terms of my knowledge, discussing a point with someone really sort of solidified. Because I think when you're going through the process of consuming content, exploring different sources of information, you're not exactly conscious of sort of the skills you're developing and the knowledge that is sort of at foundational level being developed. And I remember it was when we were having a conversation at Fabs, and I think I sort of made a link in my mind between a piece of content that I'd consumed a couple of months ago and something quite relevant. And I think realizing that is a good feeling, knowing that you do have a certain level of competency, and sort of understanding that the work, which is not something that other people are seeing, not something that necessarily you're completely conscious of where it's leading, has actually sort of solidified itself and has sort of been presented.
And I also think that, I mean, it goes back to the title of the book, Build the Invisible. And it's all of those invisible layers that sort of compound and keep developing for that sort of foundation, and then everything else that happens afterwards. I think, I got to realization at some point that when you could connect two disparate things together as talking points, imagine being able to then connect 5 things together as interesting talking points, and then actually the power of having 100 different perspectives on the same, similar, different topic, of actually then the difficulty after a while is actually working out what to say, not that you don't have anything to say. That's what I find sometimes. I get a bit overexcited at particular times, in truth, because someone wants to talk about something interesting that I think's interesting, but I sometimes have too many views on the particular thing, or my brain wants to go off in lots of different directions, because almost, I can't put it any more differently than like the neurons are going off in different ways, trying to connect the things together in order to say something that I think might be interesting, but it's otherwise. But the fundamentals is the same, which is, at some point when I'm positive, Tom, you're going to have an incredibly successful career in whatever you decide to do. Everyone will say, well, how did you go about doing the thing? What's the sort of secret? What's the sort of, the shortcut? What's the sort of silver bullet? And maybe you can speak to it in a bit of detail, but the thing I'm trying to get through in the book is that there's no secret. Like what you need to do is build these invisible foundations that nobody else sees. The stuff that you're at home that you could either be watching Netflix or YouTube or doing the thing that will be useful for your longer term. But the problem is, it's not the problem. The issue is nobody likes hearing the difficult story. Everyone wants to hear the shortcut, like, oh, I managed to do that and it got me there really quickly. Whereas the usual thing, which should hopefully make people feel better about stuff, is if you go about doing these things over a long period of time, they compound in very exciting ways. Maybe that's a contradiction in terms, but yeah.
No, I think it's, like you said, it's probably one of those understandings that takes a bit of time to properly sink in. Because especially when you see, I think the sports industry especially is probably quite guilty of this, where you see headlines, you see amazing opportunities that people are getting, amazing things that are happening, and it's quite easy to think that that's happened overnight. It's quite easy to put it down to luck, but understanding that it is sort of this foundation that's been developed over years, decades, that gets someone to that point. And like you said, playing the short and long game, I think is an understanding that takes a while to properly sink in.
Yeah, I mean, my story that I told at one of the conferences that you were at was, my journey from vegetables lawyer to football lawyer, and the first nobody cares about, because who wants to be a vegetables or agriculture lawyer? But everybody, or at least some football fans, want to be a football lawyer. Yeah. So they'll be like, oh, how did you manage to, do that transfer? And I want to hear the story of that. But the truth is, my career was built being a vegetable, car part, aviation lawyer for all of the underlying legal skills, how to draft an email, how to read regulations, how to deal with easy, difficult clients, how to deal with pressurized situations, how to work in a team, how to delegate up, how to delegate down, how to, have to show up when you don't necessarily want to and you want to go hiding because it's the easy thing to do. All of that type of stuff. And again, I'd probably say there are some of the sort of foundational stuff that is not, people don't necessarily want to hear, but I think should hopefully give people some confidence that it's not like because you haven't done the thing in the short term, it doesn't mean it won't happen for you in the long term. And this is one of the things, I think, the messages that I've been trying to get across in the book a little bit, which is at some point you just got to depressurize yourself. I think you can do two things at the same time. You might be working in an industry you might not want to work in the longer term, but what you're doing is building that invisible skill set and knowledge base and relationship building capabilities, so that at the same time, based on those skills, you can be going out looking for great opportunities in the market that you want to work in. And then when those opportunities arise for interview or arise for the actual job, then you're in a strong position to be able to say, well, yes, I haven't worked in that sector, but I know a lot about it, and here is all of this knowledge, plus here are all of my transferable skills. So I think sometimes what can happen is people get a little bit too het up in wanting to do the thing straight away. Whereas I think if that happened to me, and there were loads of times where I definitely felt like that, then I wouldn't have been now where I am, because, I more or less was working over a decade outside of the sports and football industry, not doing too much sports and football work. But that's where you sort of put your money where your mouth is and try and just keep going and wait and patiently wait for those opportunities sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, your experiences obviously have been within sport, but it's the same across industries and across different areas. In the book, you talk about the music industry, the entertainment industry, which obviously through your network, you've had connections who sort of work in those fields, and it's the same story in those industries, right?
I think there's a lot of just collective wisdom and all of that. So for the book, I specifically just didn't want to be a one-trick football pony, or even, just inside sport. And that's why I interviewed so many sort of executives from across the wider entertainment space. And it was amazing how so many stories were fantastically interesting and different, but had the same fundamental principles at heart, which was, well, how did you get to where you got to? And once we get beyond the luck part of it, where I think luck is the easy thing for people to say, which makes them feel better, that it's not because they've put their years of hard work and effort and dedication in, because somehow that doesn't sound as good as, oh, I was just lucky in the right place at the right time for this person to be able to see me or do whatever. Because you've still got to be able to do the thing and show competency and be the best person in whichever job you're going to necessarily get. But I think, well, for me, the important thing on all of that is if you can get beyond the luck stuff and then see, what is it that you're actually being able to contribute to a particular person, a particular situation. That's the bit that I found really interesting. So 2 or 3 themes. The first was they all knew what they were talking about. And that meant that either through the job that they were doing or the preparation they were doing for the job, they understood the industry. It's number 1, 2, and 3. Sometimes you can understand the finer insights of the industry from being in the industry, but you can still learn an awful lot from being in and around it in the first place. The second thing was they were actually very good at getting to know people and understand people. So we can maybe talk about sort of that building relationships and network thing shortly as well. But very good at being able to understand what other people need from them, not what they can give, what they will offer to other people effectively. And so it's that ego-less approach to stuff, which is really, really important. Listening, understanding the other person, and working out how there might be ways to be able to help the other person. And usually when you help the other person, it comes back in really beneficial ways in lots of different stuff. And the third and probably most important thing I would probably say is just dealing with setbacks constantly. Every single person I spoke to, without fail, was very open to be able to discuss all the stuff that's gone wrong. Now, it's not to say it's easy to say or to talk about, and it's not to say that there are some things that happen which are pretty bad and that might not be retrievable. But mostly, it's those safe zones of failure, in truth, where you learn from things that don't go as well as you think, or learn very well when you're out of your comfort zone and you're feeling stressed and anxious to a degree, and you're trying to work out how best to be able to do things. And all of that becomes very useful for then preparing yourself for situations where you're going to be out of your comfort zone. So, for example, you'd have read it in the book, David Lampitt, chief exec for a number of different high-profile sports companies. When he's interviewing people, he looks for a failure roadmap, I think he called it, which was he looks for particular instances where things didn't go to plan and how people reacted to it, because his view is it will always happen. And if it hasn't happened yet, it's going to come as a really big shock to someone once it eventually does. So I really like that approach, which was almost, well, tell me about the things when they haven't gone well and how did you cope with it? Because at some point it's going to happen and you need to be able to have those guardrails to actually protect yourself. But also, I think this is the most important thing. It's like a practicing thing. You've got to practice how to deal with failure. You need to practice about how to build knowledge. You've got to practice the hard decisions of stuff. And it's that practicing thing. It's not like you've either got it or you haven't. It's you can get better.
Yeah, and I think it touches quite nicely on sort of the concept or the trait of resilience, which I think is thrown around quite a lot, especially when you're looking at people for jobs and discussions with people that are quite successful. They're always saying they're looking for this resilience. And I think you touched on it there. It's not necessarily an innate skill. It's something that's developed. It's something that's practiced through this failure. What does that sort of mean to you, that sense of resilience and understanding from challenges that you're actually learning and developing that skill?
Look, I think if you'd said that to me 10 years ago, I would be trying my best to try and rack what would sound like an authentic answer, but I'm not sure would have been an authentic answer, because everybody innately is thinking, I don't want to fail. I don't want to look bad. I want to do the thing really well every time. And I don't want to be put in the uncomfortable position of someone telling me I'm not as good as I think I am. Or even worse, someone is telling me I'm as bad as I think I am. So either way is difficult. all I can say from my experience is I've had tons of moments where you think the world's going to close up in front of you effectively. And it sounds a bit melodramatic, but it's only as melodramatic as you are in your own head, in truth. If it's appraisals, or if it's work stuff, or if it's life stuff more generally. But what I would say to the failure thing, and I think failure is actually the wrong word. In truth, I've talked about it a lot in my book. My daughter uses the acronym FAIL in school as first attempt in learning, which I really like. And maybe that's the balancing to what the feeling of failure actually is. But whatever the phrase actually means, I actually think it means self-reflection. I think when things are going great, and you're on that positive upward trajectory, there's no real need to be thinking, oh, how great it is that all of these amazing things are happening, because you're just surfing the wave of the great stuff that's happening. When things aren't great, and you have all of these different negative emotions of stuff because of all the things that life throws in your way, you have no other option apart from self-reflection, in truth. And from that self-reflection comes the growth. There's no other way from it, really. If it's the Angela Duckworth book on grit, or if it's Carol Dweck's book on mindset, they were probably the two ones that gave me the best foundations for thinking about growth mindset, and for thinking about how to become a little bit more resilient. And I think the truth is, even if you've had a really, really tough life, or you've had a very straightforward life, and then things good happen or things bad happen or otherwise, and everyone's usually right in the middle of all of that, in truth, then the idea is to try and understand yourself, really, and see why things have happened in a particular way. And usually it's not because of anybody else, it's just because of yourself. And then what happens is you go through a bit of a reflective journey to be able to work out why and how you can improve. Maybe it's in your mindset. So Carol Dweck gave a great TED Talk, I know you're a big TED Talk fan, on the power of yet. So she read a report about a school that doesn't give pass and fails in primary school. They give passes, and they give NY. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I really like that approach to failure, which is, it's not failing, it's just it hasn't happened yet. And I think a really easy mindset approach, which I'm totally plagiarizing from her, is just add the end yet onto a negative sentence, and it immediately turns what could be a negative feeling or emotion into a positive one, because it feels a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah. And then sort of throughout your career, how has this mindset shifted? Is it something that you think has happened for yourself more recently? Looking back on your experience as sort of a more junior lawyer, and back when you were really just first starting out, how do you think your mindset and approach in that regard has changed?
Well, I just thank goodness that I had lots and lots of lovely lawyers and friends, in a way, that weren't as critical as they could have been about my work, really, because sometimes, you're just starting off. You're never going to be the perfect lawyer. But there were lots of lawyers when I was a trainee or when I was a junior lawyer that took their time to really help me. To almost be like, no, you shouldn't write an email like this because it can come across like that, or don't use that word, or use less words to be able to say this, or actually you need to think about that more, or think about this more. So I would say the answer is empathy, to a degree. You put yourself in the position of your younger self and think, how would I like to be treated if I wanted to try and be treated, respectfully and with, a degree of compassion. And I know that's not always the case, but whenever that's the case now, wherever I'm working with, the people in my team and the wider team at Sheridan's and whoever else it might be, my first, second and third thought has to be, everyone's a human being, everyone wants to do well. And there aren't very many people that want to self-sabotage and show that they're doing poorly or otherwise. So my role, in a way, is to be able to demonstrate that, it sounds a bit trite, like they're in a safe place. Like, we know you're good enough, but it doesn't mean every piece of work is going to be exactly the same level. So how do you go about showing someone, and I'm not the foundation of all knowledge, far from it, but from my experience, how to go about improving the drafting of something, or how, in a particular situation, things could be handled differently. And the truth is that goes both ways. Sometimes, in order to be able to say that to others, you've got to be able to take it as well. So you've got to have others be able to show the same behaviors to say, you know what, Dan, for that particular thing, I did it this way rather than this, or that happened in a particular way. So, and I'm speaking in riddles a little bit, but you know, that two-way process can be quite important. And you know, whatever the word failure is, I think it's more or less a learning journey. That sounds even worse. Sounds very worse. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, and then I think one of the interesting points is this idea of perfectionism and everything having to be perfect. And I think, again, with sort of the almost external validation that you get from putting things out there that are well polished, and without showing everything that's gone behind it, all of the, not failures, the challenges and improvements that you've had to make to get to this final product, it is at times very easy to think that everyone else is perfect in what they're doing. And something that you talked about before is progress over perfection, and understanding that it's just sort of about progressing and making those steps in the right direction. Again, sort of how did you sort of come to that understanding and sort of reach the point where I know sort of when you were younger, almost a perfectionist, a lot of the work you were doing, obviously you're quite harsh on yourself to make sure it's at a right standard. How has that sort of developed for you?
It's totally right. I'm going to say like two counterintuitive things. It's almost like you are paralyzed by perfection, and if that's the case, then you'll never do anything, is the truth. But at the same time, you've got to understand that paralysis in order to actually do anything. So the way that I try and do it is, if I give the example of Build the Invisible book, that it's still taken me over 2.5 years to write it, and it's only 22,000 words. Done Deal took me 3 years to write and is 85,000 words. So either I've been a lot more efficient with Done Deal, or I've had to spend a lot more time trying to get it right with Build Invisible. Words isn't necessarily, you know, a measure of, you know, how good anything is, far from it. But what I would say on that is I do two things. The first thing is, you can tell I'm hesitating because there's loads of different things. The first thing is, in order to be able to do anything, you've got to start. And to some people, having to be perfect means they'll never start in the first place, which is obviously a horrible place to be for anybody, in truth. So I'm always of the view that you've just got to start, and it will always, always get better. And the way that I almost see it is like a filtering process. So you put the first thing out there, and it's the same with Build the Invisible. Like, probably most of the words that I used in my first drafts are probably not there anymore. That's the case.
Yeah.
Dan Friedman in one of the interviews I did for the book was exactly the same. He put one paragraph to his editor, and he's the author of Jamie Johnson, one of the best kids football books ever written. And he showed me a paragraph, and he showed me the paragraph afterwards, and almost every word had changed. So that made me feel a bit better, in truth. So the act of starting that to beginning is really important. And then what happens is you just filter. And you sometimes filter 50 times, you sometimes filter 20 times, or sometimes you filter 100 times, until you get something in as good a space as that you think it's as you think it's good enough to potentially get out there. My measure is, would I be proud of this work if it goes out to somebody to read? I try and positively put it round. It was like a pride thing. So one of my bosses at my old place, Phil Fisher, John Castles, he would always say to me, be proud in the work that you are putting out. And if you're not, then it's not ready. If it is, then great. But you've got to have that measure. And then afterwards, it's an objective measure. It's, can you give it to one or two other people, and they can give their thoughts, sort of people that you think will, you respect in terms of their skill set, and can they then can you get the confidence from them that actually it's in good shape? Because otherwise, if you just never put anything out there, well, you're not. I mean, it says what it says on the tin in a way. That's not to say that you have to rush it and do otherwise, but you've got to find that middle way ground of it being uncomfortable, but you still having confidence in your own abilities. and it doesn't need to be perfect, but it still needs to be damn bloody good. I mean, that's the ultimate line in the end, really. And it's just working out processes for doing that. And I've got, thank goodness, got quite a good process of now people telling me, if it's my dad or my mum or you, actually, when you had to read through the manuscript as well and came up with some really useful points as well, then you've also got to have the lack of ego sometimes to be able to actually say, actually, that's a much better way of phrasing it, or I should remove that, or no, you know what, I'm fine with that, and everything in between.
And I mean, you touched on it quite nicely there, talking about sort of the people that you have around you that are really good soundboards for understanding how sort of you're progressing. I know that family is quite important for you, or very important for you. In terms of developing mentors and sort of a close circle of support, how important for that is, or how important has that been for sort of your development throughout your career?
Well, yeah, I mean, I could go on for ages about that, but I think probably if I flip it round a little bit and say it's really important for everybody to try and find people that are willing to invest a bit of time in them, in truth. And it's not easy to do, but I think it goes back to a more fundamental point around building relationships with people. You know, in the beginning, I think it's important not to see it as a sort of transaction where you're reaching out to people because of what they can do for you. Again, it's the sort of getting to yes and otherwise point. And when you're able to find people, I think, that are willing to spare some time, or are willing to be able to help build that journey for you, whatever that journey might be, it can be quite liberating, actually. You know, my old boss, Charles Worthington at Field Fisher, he was just a really lovely mentor that would, you know, tell it how it is to me, but at the same time, be very empathetic at the same time. And what ends up happening, even if, just as you said right at the beginning on, just to see how people go about doing things, I think that's really important for, you know, anyone to be able to see, is actually how do the people that you think do good things go about doing those points in lots of different ways. And I've spent a long time trying to find and reach out to people that I've seen, you know, outwardly look like they've done good things, but, you know, the processes might not be brilliant, and you might think, well, actually, that's not the way I want to do it. And then there's loads of people that you reach out to and that you build relationships with for mutual benefit, that then it becomes very useful for. So, look, I'm lucky that in my family, I'm sort of surrounded by just football nuts in a way. So I grew up in my house and my cousins' houses we just played football all day, and we talked football all day. And really, there wasn't that much outside life apart from that to me for quite some time. But that sort of meant that, you know, every other weekend we were all going to Anfield together to watch the game, and it was, you know, as routine as you could possibly imagine and everything. And that sort of family network has continued to be really important for me. Most of my family now live in London rather than Liverpool as well, which is lovely. And, you know, we always still get together for the matches. And if we're talking about important things or nonsense things like, you know, what player's going to play in what position or otherwise it might be, that sort of family dynamics, yeah, quite important still. I think people get a little bit pressurized and overpressured when people say, oh, you've got to build your network and you've got to have strong relationships with people, and, you know, where do you begin? I think is actually the hardest thing to start thinking about. And a lot of the time, I mentioned a particular thing in the book, which is sometimes the network is right in front of you and you don't necessarily know it. And that can sometimes be with friends, parents, or family. It might be with your own family and family friends. And sometimes what you've actually got to do to start out with is almost be your own advocate, which is when you're speaking to people generally, to be able to sort of explain to them that you're interested in fashion or tech or AI or movies or esports or whatever else it might be. And then actually be quite specific and say, do you know anybody in those industries? Or even if they don't know anyone in those industries, that generally it might be that they come across people and otherwise. It happens to me quite a lot of the time where people will just have the conversations and say, oh, you need to speak to my son or daughter or nephew or cousin or friend or whatever else it might be. And that's a really important start, I think, to be able to work through a little bit of an inventory on where your network or relationships might start, which is actually, I think, a really important thing. I also think then that people can get a little bit overawed because, you start with zero, but the point is everybody starts with zero. And how do you get to 1 and how do you get to 5 and how do you get to 10 is always the question. But sometimes the easiest thing is to actually find the relationship. The hardest thing is actually to nurture it. Really, I would say. So there's all of that in the book, especially we can talk about, which is it's not necessarily just having the initial conversation. It's following up. It's thinking about the other person. It's following up and having another conversation with them. It's maybe thinking about them and seeing what might be useful to connect them into somebody else or otherwise, and everything else that flows from there. So I think when people say building network, I think network's the wrong word in a way because it feels very impersonal, and it feels very transactional. Whereas actually the answer, I think, is how do you find one person and start to have a conversation with them about something that you're interested in? And then you start from there. And if you can do that, it feels a little bit more micro, i.e. it feels a little bit more manageable. And that's always the first step. There's no point trying to build a relationship with 100 people if you've never done it in the first place. You should start with 5 and see where you can get to. And then the other thing on the relationship building, which has been really helpful for me looking back and reflecting, is I would be one of my strongest pieces of advice is there's no point trying to build if you are, let's say, as I was 20 years ago, a junior lawyer, a trainee lawyer, there's no point, and I want to try and build business and work with football clubs and agents, there's just no point me emailing the chief executive of the biggest football agency in the country and saying, give me some work. Not that you'd say, give me some work, but you'd say, let me help your firm. Yeah. Because the status dynamic is too extreme. The idea generally, which will tend to work better, I would suggest, is you finding people more of your level from across the different industries so that you grow together and that they realize that you're not just in it for the business, you're in it to build the relationships at the same level of status. So a lot of my strongest relationships have come from people that started out in the industry actually at the same time as me, if not later. So that then what happens is we grow together, the sea rises at the same time together, and that we're able to effectively see beyond the status of it all and realize that we've known each other for 15 years. It's not because suddenly they're a really high profile person in sport. I knew them when there was the intern doing the thing before the thing that they're now doing, and you know them well enough to understand how the relationship dynamics work. So I think that's that two things: start small and think about the people that are at the same level as you, and that can sometimes make a big difference.
And if we look at that in practice, I know that a lot of people that are going to be reading this book will be young students, young professionals, similar to myself, who are trying to build those communities and understanding how you can progress in an industry. In practice, what does that look like for you?
Well, that's exactly the point. For me, it's as forensic as possible. So I'll try and give you a few examples. And my clients and friends and relationship partners won't mind me saying it. But, if you are meeting somebody for the first time and you've managed to get an introduction to them, or you've seen them at a conference and you're following up and going for a coffee, what you've got to work out, you've really got to do your homework, is the truth. So there's always two things. Homework is key. Understand what they do, what company they're at, the type of things that they're doing, the type of things they're interested in. And then I think the other thing is making sure, if possible, you're listening a lot more than you are speaking. I think always the ego is in part of all of us is a bit like, let me show you how much I know about the great things that we can talk about.
Marketing yourself.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the whole idea of being able to listen and get that intel is absolutely key. And, there's a great book called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. He has a whole couple of chapters about, people generally come out of meetings where they've talked a lot about themselves, feeling great about the meeting.
Yeah.
I definitely do. We all do. It's hard to control that sort of ego side of us sometimes, which means then the feeling that the person has about the meeting they've just had with you remains really positive.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can't work out why it's positive, but it's usually because you've said positive things about the stuff that's going on, and that can sometimes one dimension of the overall pie. So the bit then that happens, if we're talking about the forensic elements, is okay, so you've come out of the meeting, what's the follow-up? What have you noted? What have they said to you? So I have a spreadsheet. I have a CRM system as well, where I will, with all of my contacts and all of the people that I work with, or alongside or otherwise, I'll be like, right, well, we talked about these 3 things today. And what we actually did was we only talked for 10 minutes about work because they were actually interested in telling me about, their new tennis racket, or where they went on holiday, or the new book that they were reading, or how their kids are doing, or where would you recommend something or other, or a new book recommendation, or whatever else it might be. So sometimes people, and again, not that this is a book club again, but Surrounded by Idiots is a great guide to understand personality types as well, because you're not going to just have one size fits all approach to people and people that you're trying to build relationships with. Mm-hmm. So the idea is it's person X at this company, they do this. These are the things we talked about. He or she is more likely to talk about family or work. These are the things we talked about family. These are the things we talked about work. These are the names of their kids. These are the schools that they go to. These are the things that they do. I'm going to follow up again right afterwards within 2 days with a follow-up email saying, great to chat. These are the things we talked about. I'm going to put a reminder on my system to be able to get in touch with them in 2 months again. And then I'm going to rinse and repeat, but not in a transactional way. Just reach out on a WhatsApp or a voice message or a text message and say, haven't seen you guys for a while. I remember we were talking about that particular thing. How's it going? Or the exact opposite, which is you read an interesting article and it's on your phone and it's about the sector that the person's in and it's an update on something, and you just WhatsApp it over to them and say, I thought this might be interesting for you. So the thing is, it's like a mindset switch a lot of the time. It's thinking about where the relationship is, beginner, intermediate, advanced, really, how strong it is, the types of nuanced content that you can intel that you can understand about the person, in truth, how you can help them, how you shows that you're listening to them. It's probably one of the most important things, really, in a way, is demonstrating that you're really listening to what they're saying. It's really key. And then building foundation on foundation on foundation. And that's just one person in one company doing one thing.
Yeah, I think when you talk about obviously the system almost that you have set up now, it can sound quite daunting because it seems like there's so much that goes into it. But I think it's important to make sure that we keep distilling this down to it starts with one person. It starts with building that relationship. And I think you touched on authenticity. I think that's certainly one of the key things that I've certainly learned from your book and from talking to you. It's developing those genuine relationships, not understanding it as transactional. I give you something, you give me something back. It's doing stuff for sort of building that relationship in the most genuine fashion. Yeah,
and I think one of the phrases I always think about is you can't see beyond the opportunity that hasn't arisen yet. It's the yet bit as well, because a lot of people. It's funny. We're having this conversation just before in prep for what we were chatting about now, and people will say to me sometimes, they'll say, "Oh, how come you managed to do all of this stuff? The book and the work and life and kids and family and all whatever else it might be." And I sometimes say, "Well, it's because I've got loads of really great people around me, yourself included, all the team at Sheridan's, other people that help volunteer to be able to do particular things." And everyone says, "Well, how do you get all these volunteers to just help you out?" And I actually gave this some thought over the last few weeks, because I was like, actually, why do they? But you touched upon it in the beginning. In part, it's because I think it's useful to build credibility and transactionally on your CV to say, well, I've worked with Daniel on doing this and hopefully he's a great guy. But more importantly, what tends to happen on the way, and it's happened almost with every single person that is kind enough to work with me, is they just get introduced to loads of interesting people. And those doorways that I think are quite straightforward because I'm more established in the industry are not easy and straightforward for more junior people to be able to find those ways in. And also when more senior people say, well, I've got this role and I don't know someone that might be useful, do you know anybody? Then it's really easy for me to say, actually, Tom's the perfect person for you to speak to. Or, for example, all the digital editing stuff with Bart, who's my guy on that side. He got loads of business because in the end, when he was editing my podcast and the YouTube stuff and Instagram and TikTok stuff originally as well, about 15 of my clients said, how are you doing all of this stuff? And I said, to be fair, I'm not. It's this guy. So, he built a business or part of a business out of just a few referrals that happened because people had seen the stuff that I was doing. So just to reiterate, it's sort of, opportunities, I can't remember the phrase now, opportunities compound as they exist. No, hold on. You tell me. It's in here. Hold on.
It'll be somewhere in this huge document.
You keep going and I'll tell you what it was.
Well, I was wanting to quickly touch on your relationship with Bart.
Yes.
Because I think it speaks to a lot of the content that you talk about and actually how to build those relationships. So would you want to quickly go into how you first met Bart, how you first managed to get in touch with him?
Opportunities multiply as they are seized.
There we go.
That we got there in the end. But yes, and just before I do that, because that's important, because I think what we're trying to say is you can't see behind the corner. In the same way that, in the beginning you'd have thought, well, I'll have a chat with Daniel, we'll see what happens. But I presume 5 months on, you wouldn't have thought we'd be doing a cool chat together talking about my book.
Certainly not.
Yeah, which is great. And that's what I sort of love about it. And it's the same with Bart. So what happened in 2019 was he wrote to me as an undergrad law student in the Northeast, saying he'd done work for Gary Vaynerchuk, the online influencer,
Gary V.
and businessman, yeah. Gary V. On all of his Polish channels, and he'd like just to help me do the same in a slightly different way for all of the content that I have. And it just so happened that the timing was just perfect because I had all of this content from all of these different video recordings and stuff I had done, but I had no competency or ability to be able to edit, think about, document and do. And so he just said, let me help you and we'll get cracking. And that's the sort of getting to yes part that actually really made me stuck in my mind, and which I talk about in the book, which was he simply said, he wrote at the end of the message, which I think I definitely put in the book, which is just say yes. So that's all I had to do, which then got me thinking about the wider point in the book, which is how do you get to yes? We can talk about that in a second. But with Bart, I mean, it was revolutionary and revelationary at the same time because he just had his particular skill set, which was incredibly valuable to me, but actually quite straightforward for him to deliver. And as a result of that, that just got through that, he then managed to get introduced to tons of people in the sports industry that he wants to do. He's got a great job in the city now that he's working really hard at. And he still has this as a bit of a, side hustle that he helps me with at different times. So it's just, a great story of two particular things positively complementing each other at the same time.
Yeah, and I guess sort of the flip side of that is understanding that if there's an application that doesn't go successfully, if you're looking for a career change possibly or a new opportunity that you don't get, it's often timing. It's understanding that it's not always at your detriment. Things are happening for a reason, and a lot of the time they're out of your control.
Yep. You've been reading the book.
I have.
Thank you. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing to mention, which is patience and thinking long term is the key. It sounds the most boring things, unfortunately. It's almost like build the foundation, get a process, be patient, think long term. But in my experience, I can say that's what's worked for me. And I think from all the people that I've interviewed, that's the type of thing that's worked for them, which is, at the end of Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, she has this section where she talks about the word passion. And passions, as you know, is Latin form is pati, and pati's literal translation is to suffer, which I found quite mind-blowing actually, because everybody talks about the thing they want to do as the thing that they're passionate about. Now, I'm not sure whether if they knew the actual literal term, they wouldn't use the phrase, but maybe actually people are using it for the right reason. So when they say they're passionate about something, what they're really talking about, at least technically, is their ability to suffer for the thing that they want to do. So I almost take that as a positive idea, which is if you need to be patient, if you need to think long term, if you're going to do it anyway, if you need to be able to think about all the things that are inside and outside of your control, then what you are actually doing is positively suffering for the outcome in the end. And sometimes you can't control the outcome, granted, but what you can do is depressurize yourself and stretch this opportunity window, which I talk about in the book. It's like, if the window isn't open right that second, that doesn't mean that it's never going to happen and that you should just stop and never do the same thing and drop your ideas and your dreams straight away. My view is actually, usually if the opportunity window is only open for that second, it's not the right time. But what can you then do as a result? Well, it doesn't matter if you are, if you really want to get into sports marketing, for example, how about becoming the best marketeer for the first 5 years of your career so that you've worked on loads of great brand campaigns? And then what happens is when you see a sports marketing role in 5 years, because you've been looking out for those pages on the recruitment pages, because you've still been doing your side hustle of understanding how sports marketing works and process, and then you've developed all of those skills, then what happens, again, I touch upon it in the book a tiny bit, is when you go for that role and when you get that interview and when you're speaking to the people, when you have an entry-level job in sports or a particular industry, everybody's going for that role. There's not much that you can differentiate yourself from, really, in truth. But when you're 5 years on the path and you've got a certain skill set, what happens is the industry needs you more than you need the industry. And that's an important mindset switch sometimes. There are going to be less people the longer you are in the profession that can do the same thing that you can do. Whereas in the beginning, for those entry-level jobs, everybody theoretically can do the same thing. So sometimes counterintuitively, not going into the area that you want to get into in the short to medium term is much more beneficial, and has been to me, than trying to start out doing the thing that you really want to do.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the people that you've conducted these interviews with will probably say from their experience they've had a similar journey. I think especially as the sports industry itself has been rapidly growing and developing, the opportunities that are now available sort of simply weren't there 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I think it's testament to the fact that your journey especially, you've gone through this process of developing your skills to the best of your ability through your legal experience away from sport, and then seeing how this has transitioned across into the role you're in now.
I just want to think about making it more attainable and obtainable for people, and not for them to be too demoralized about the journey that they're going to have to go on, because as you'll have read in the book, like one of my core thoughts is actually about identity sometimes. And sometimes it's a good thing and sometimes it's a bad thing, in truth. But I think if you identify with the thing that you're really interested in doing, it becomes quite an important part of your identity. You're probably going to do it anyway. And for me, although it may look like I'm quite one-dimensional then as a result if it's football or sport, but that's been a real big superpower of mine in the end, is you've got to be able to combine the technical knowledge with your sector knowledge, granted, but I want it to be an optimistic story, in truth, which is just because it doesn't happen now doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And the things that are outside of your control is exactly as you said. It might be a downturn in the industry. It might not be entry-level jobs for you. It might be someone else did a better interview and got through ahead of you. It might be that one grade in your A-levels or degree meant that you did this or that or otherwise. But what you have to keep doing is keep grinding. I'm not saying that it's like this hustle culture where you're just working 24/7 and doing everything possible and all that type of thing, because you've got to have a balance. But when you are more time rich, as younger people generally tend to be, and for me, I have to be sometimes quite a little bit more efficient with my time and planning, then you have the ability to be able to do and think and do more. And by doing that, even if you are doing that side hustle, which doesn't necessarily need to be the core thing that's going to sustain you for the next 50 years of your life in terms of the job, it will start taking you closer into the pathways that will probably be more fulfilling for you, I think.
Yeah, and then I guess sort of slightly switching direction and touching on something that we mentioned previously, talking there about the sort of the process of building that knowledge, and when you've got the time, being able to really educate yourself and differentiate yourself in that sense. If we look at sources of where you can receive that content, what have you found to be sort of the best areas in that sense? And I think one of the things to note here is that it can be very overwhelming with the sheer amount of content that's out there, especially as someone starting out on this journey, not knowing exactly what the next step's going to look like. Yeah. It can be very intimidating when you've got so many different voices and different sources of information.
Yes, and it's funny, we've gone from one extreme to the other. I almost feel really happy that I've got so much to be able to read, because I didn't in the past, in truth. When I was growing up, I would sort of read the one page of Liverpool football news 3 times because there was nothing else for me to be able to read.
Yeah.
Whereas now, I know it's different for lots of different generations, but I never feel overawed. I tend not to feel overawed because I'm just like, I'll just read something else. It's great. There's something, I'll find something pretty quickly to be able to do. But I think you've got to start being quite routined in it. So that was the reason why I sort of put the Build Invisible journal alongside it. I can't even say the word, never mind do the book. The Build Invisible journal alongside it, because what I put in the book, which I then suggest in the journal, is people just read or consume content, 3 pieces of content a day. Now, I know some people might like reading less or more, and some people might like listening less or more. Some people might like watching less or more, which is fine. I'm platform agnostic to a degree, which means I don't mind where you get the information from, as long as you do it. But to your quite specific question, I think, which is a very important one, is you've just got to be kind to yourself and start small. That's it. Don't beat yourself up too much on what you find or what you're interested in. You just got to do it. So that then, I've got each day there's 3 little lines which say, right, I read an athletic piece on basketball, and I read an economist piece on AI, and I read a Guardian piece on women's football, for example. That's it. Done. Tick for the day. And what happens is, after a while, as we've talked about, it just becomes the thing that you do. So then Tuesday comes along and you do it because it's Tuesday. And then 4 weeks' time, it's a Wednesday, and you're not really thinking about doing it anymore because it's just quite a ingrained routine for you to do. And the types of content out there, look, I say it in the book, is if you're really lacking in inspiration, I mean that genuinely, you just got to Google the words that you're interested in. So if it's fashion, kids, jewelry, that's what it might be. Or for me, it is football, finance, broadcasting, transfers, whatever Liverpool. Else it might be. I try to stay away from that, but yes. And then what happens after a while is the dots start connecting a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, what the next phase basically of the Build the Invisible journal will hopefully be is people start color coordinating particular parts of it. So you start linking stories that you've read to a YouTube video that you've watched, to a podcast that you've listened to on that particular topic. And then there's a reflection thing, which is what's the thing you've enjoyed reading the most that week, and how's it linked to something else that you've potentially done. So again, you can always have these lofty ideas and ideals about being the best, having the best knowledge about football broadcasting rights, for example. But you've got to first start off with the foundations of reading and listening and watching and doing. And if you can do that, and we're only really talking probably about 20 minutes in your day, then you can usually go about doing it in reason. Like sometimes it might be a longer YouTube clip or otherwise, but a TED talk or whatever. the I think one of the most important things, I think it's two important things, is timing. So when will you go? When will you do it? Some people are morning people, some people are evening people, some people do it in their lunch times or otherwise. And sometimes you can vary it. So it's very important to think about when you will consume that content in whichever form that it might be in order to get it into its routine. And I think if you can work out the when, the routine becomes a lot more straightforward. And after the when concept, I think the most important thing is, which links into the failure thing and the links into being a bit kinder to yourself and links into the self-reflection thing a little bit, I think, is when you don't do it for the day, what are you going to do the next day? Are you going to make it 2 days in a row? Are you going to make it 3 days in a row that you don't do it? Or is it going to be a week and then you're going to be like, oh, I'm a bad person now because I haven't managed to do the thing? Or are you going to jump back on the horse and do it again? And I think that's the fundamental point, which is we're all human beings. We're all fallible. We're always not going to... We're all lazy is the wrong word, but what I mean is we're usually the course of least resistance. It's like, oh, don't worry, I'll just do it later. And then later happens, then you don't do it. But I know I can be lazy. I definitely know I can be lazy at times where I have to shortcut my brain to be like, yes, I know I can be that, but I'm not going to.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it doesn't happen all the time. There's definitely some nights I'll just sit on the couch and watch Star Trek and Netflix, basically, if I can help it.
Yeah.
But I'm probably sharing too much. But the point is on that, which is it's really, really important that when it doesn't go to plan, what are you going to do? And there's a chapter in the book on that routine bit, which is how do you put particular hooks in place to be able to make sure you do it. Thinking about when is really important. And the great thing is when it doesn't go to plan and when you don't do it for a particular reason, how do you not make it 2 days, 3 days, a week, a month before you get back to doing it, if that's in fact what you want to do?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting topic to explore because there are so many different sort of aspects to it to discuss. And I think it was certainly part of the book that resonated with me, quite significantly is, again, I think it's very easy to think that everyone else is perfect in what they're doing. Everyone else is making great progress. Mm-hmm. And then if you do have a bit of a down period in sort of what you're working towards, it can have quite a negative effect, especially if you internalize that. And I think it's crucial to understand that not to be so harsh on yourself. You can have days where things don't happen, and that's fine. I think I heard a really good analogy. I think Stephen Bartlett was talking about it last week on his podcast, and they were making the comparison between sort of your physical health and then your mental health. And if you're going to the gym regularly and one day you're just feeling a bit achy, you're not feeling great, and you don't lift the weight that you want to, you put it down as a bad day, and it's quite easy to move on from it and just put it down to didn't get enough sleep, etc. But you don't do the same. Their comparison was for your mental health. If you have a down day, it's fine, but being able to move on and like you said, it's how you sort of respond to that. And I think it ties in quite nicely with the importance and sort of the role that the journal plays in this. I know that for you, tracking what you're doing and that sense of accountability is very important, and especially sort of more recently you found that to be extremely beneficial. How do you think the journal sort of links in with keeping yourself accountable and sort of having that evidence to back up the work you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it might not be for everyone, is the truth, but I know I for a long time was a bit like, oh, processes and routines and journals, not for me. I can, but it was just before lockdown, or just as lockdown happened, actually, and I started thinking about building Visible as a book and doing career talks and the rest of it, and being at home a lot and having a very new routine, in truth, and not being in the office, got me into a few different routines. And I wanted to make sure that I was doing the things every day. So I actually got the James Clear Tracker journal from his book, Atomic Habits.
Yep.
And I just noted down probably the 5 things that I wanted to do every day. And I didn't do them every day, but I did quite a lot of them most days, is the truth, which was exercise, book writing, gratitude, going for a walk, and reading with my kids. And they were the 5 things I tried to do every day. Some I did more than others. But articulating that was actually quite an important thing. What are my short-term what's like my priority list? That in itself was actually quite a good thing for me to start thinking about. And so the other thing that actually got me to do was 6 o'clock every day with my dad, who obviously no one was seeing anybody during lockdown. We'd have a 10-minute FaceTime exercise class, me and him, every day, every weekday. To the extent that whenever I was working sometimes and couldn't do it, he would phone me and be like, why aren't we doing it today? So he, from me trying to convince him that it was a good thing to do, he's absolutely regimented with it now still, post lockdown and post COVID, which was great actually. So it just gave us that 10 minutes and we did, 40 sit-ups, 40 push-ups, some band work, some squats, and repeat, and that was it. And then you tick it off for the day, and you feel good that you've had a bit of time with your dad as well, and you feel like you've actually built up a bit of a sweat as well. But I go off on tangents here because because the bit is for me, having that accountability was really, really important. It was the same when I was doing a fitness tracker thing for a while. You had to send the green tick at the end of the day saying you'd done the exercise, you'd done the healthy eating, you'd done the drinking the water, the green tea, whatever else it might be. And I underestimated the power of human nature to want to be validated. So in the same way, I felt the journal was a good way to be able to get everybody actually noting down the stuff, because I actually think there can be quite a proud accountability thing to it all, which is I really hope it will happen. Hopefully it will happen at some point where, somebody will send me a picture of a page of their Build Invisible journal with all of the things that they've written down and the highlights and the stuff. And then somebody will literally send me a video of a year's worth of someone doing it. And I'll be like, that is proper. Yeah. Hopefully that will actually give me a lot of pride that actually I've been able to do something which has been of value to somebody. Because imagine having, as I said, 3 pieces of content 5 times a week, every month, and for a year. That's a huge amount of content and knowledge building that someone will have acquired in 1 year, never mind in 2 years, never mind in 5, never mind in a decade or so. And that's the micro to macro, I think, really.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to quite an interesting point on habit formation. And it's something that you explore in quite a lot of detail in the book, and bring in different people's opinions on sort of, how you develop those habits. How do you sort of think that links in with this idea of identity and how you sort of, how you think about yourself?
Yeah, I'm always a little bit cautious because I don't want, for me, I know I've got different identities in a way, and, external and internal identities. And I'm always really conscious about saying, you are your habits, and your habits become your identity and your processes and everything else as a result. Because what you sometimes don't want to do is then, for your identity to be rolled up in one thing that then doesn't work, and then you sometimes might feel that your identity and everything else has unraveled because of the thing that hasn't necessarily happened. My counter to that is, I'm of the firm view that nothing is a waste and everything is an opportunity. So no matter what you do, if you can, you should be able to find the thing that is of value out of whatever you've done, even if it feels like a dead end, or even if it feels like a waste, or even if it feels like it hasn't worked out for you. So I think if you can be reasonable with your identity, what ends up happening is, and kind with yourself is, again, I'm still not at ease at this with myself, is the truth, in a way, because I am a little bit obsessive. I do things, 100% in, and it won't be for everybody. But I know that if my identity is innately wrapped up in my work and in my family and in the things that I want to do, like my leisure time, like writing books and playing tennis or whatever else it might be, that works for me. It works for me. Yeah. So I get closer towards the thing that I want to do. So I get identified as the football lawyer, as the writer, as the person that goes on does podcasts with you. that, goes for walks or whatever else it might be. And I'm fine with that as an identity trait, but I know that that can be difficult for other people to consider, as like sometimes you want different identities for different things. But I know for me, an identity wrapped up, which is, I'll give you one example. Everyone says, well, isn't Build the Invisible work for you? Like actually work, it takes you time. The truth is I don't see there sometimes being a difference between work and leisure. Sometimes it's the same. That's maybe a really good thing. That can sometimes be a bad thing, but that's still my identity in a way. Some people say, well, that means like we're doing now, we're here on a Saturday morning doing stuff. Now, some people would say this is work. Some people would say this is great and play and leisure because this is what we're doing. But either way, this is our sacrifice from doing something else. So does that mean that your identity is more caught up in what we're doing now or less? I don't know the answer to that for everyone. But for me, my identity wrapped up into sport and book and work and family and the stuff that I get enjoyment out of is me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for younger people who are reading the book and again looking to make their first steps in the industry, I think that's quite an important thing to understand, because a lot of the stuff we're talking about and that is outlined very well in the book is almost this extra work. So it's reaching out to people, building relationships, it's consuming this content on top of most people who already have extremely large workloads, whether that's as a student, as a young professional. And I think it's understanding that if you really find fulfillment and enjoyment in those extra responsibilities that you're taking on, that's how you sort of develop the sustainability and consistency to keep it up over the long term.
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better. Definitely use that clip. And I think the other thing that I actually got to quite late in the day with the end, the sort of conclusion and end chapters with Build the Invisible was this relationship I had with learning. And it's taken me a long time to realize it actually, which is, over time, when we're in school and when we're at university and when we're, at law school and then, developing careers, I think my relationship with learning was quite a transactional relationship really, which was learn to pass the exam, to get the grade, to put on the CV, to get to the next phase, to get the job really. And as a result, all of that knowledge building, unless it was something that you really enjoyed, and there were parts of it that I did, but quite a lot of it that was less enjoyable, it just withers away in a way. It doesn't stick in your brain unless you're constantly reinforcing it. And that is part of the reason for the journal, because if you're constantly reinforcing the stuff that you've read 3 months ago because it links into something that you've read yesterday, it will stick more because you're making those neural connections effectively. And I think as a result, when you're learning for learning's sake in order to pass an exam, you're less likely to give it your all, apart from I need to do really well in the exam and I need to have that knowledge for that particular purpose. That was probably what I was a little bit guilty of in truth. But whereas I think it's taken me a while to realize that, me reading and doing and building knowledge bases in lots of different things. So I'm fascinated by AI at the moment, for example. So I'm going on a bit of an AI deep dive right now. Then it becomes that stickier. It becomes that more accessible for you. And instead of it being a transactional arrangement to pass an exam, you're doing it because you realize it will actually be best for you. It will help your skills, it will help your relationships, it will give you probably greater wisdom, it will allow you to be able to do things better, it will connect the dots in together, it means you'll have better conversations as well. So everything starts very small, but nicely spirals out in lots of real positive ways.
So we have previously talked about this, building relationships and how it can be quite difficult to know where to begin. Now, one of the points that you touch on quite a lot and speak very well about is flipping the conversation. So what does that sort of, that idea mean for you?
Yeah, I think too many people generally tend to write emails saying, please help me out. And I think the outcome of that is usually pretty bad. So my way of trying to increase the odds a tiny bit is, and it takes more effort and consideration, is to actually, when you're reaching out to somebody, if it's digitally or otherwise, think about what they need. And not only what they need, but how they can simply say yes. So flipping the conversation is more or less, how do you get the other person to say yes? And it might well be, for example, you say, let me bring you coffee every morning. Or it might be, let me write you a scouting report. Or it might be, let me write you a review of a new band. Or let me tell you about this new social media platform. Let me tell you about this or that. And what you want to be able to do is, you don't need to be best friends with the person. You don't need to be able to, get a job from the person. You just need them to respond with a yes, which then allows you to demonstrate your competency in a very straightforward way. And that is the act of beginning, I think.
And then on that point of switching the conversation, getting to yes, in the book you explore a number of really good examples and practical examples of how to do this. From your experience, what are some of those?
I have to remember them now. Yeah, what are those examples? Yes, so there's a few things. I think the first thing is, I think if you can avoid trying to find the senior people in the company. They're less likely to be time rich. They're going to be very time poor and have much more probably more important things to deal with than responding to you, in truth. So the real question is, how do you try and maximize your chance of a response? I would say the type of thing you would do is, if it's LinkedIn or if it's a particular Insta profile, or if it's onto whatever else it might be, whichever is you think the best medium for that response, is to be able to find people at the lower end of the career platform who have maybe made their first steps into the particular industry or the agency or the job that you want to potentially follow in the footsteps with. They're likely to be more empathetic because they've done the thing and they realize probably how hard it is. They're more likely to have more time at the beginning as well, to be able to then potentially be able to respond to you. And it might well be that they will be quite liking the fact that people are reaching out to them as a novelty, because they've started on the journey that they now see that someone else is trying to find as well. So it's those combinations of things. I think the other important thing is, you shouldn't be writing an essay. I see a lot of people, it's with all best intentions, writing 4 paragraphs about why they want to work in the industry, why they want to do this. I think you've just got to be really short and sharp with the request, and the request shouldn't be, please give me work experience, because that usually takes a lot of time for someone to be able to organize and do. Yep. That's not to say it might not happen at some point in the future, but the first thing is to build enough rapport that you can start that relationship with that person. And as we said before, I think that just simply becomes, how can you write a short message that gets them to say yes? And then you get their email address, and then you send over whatever it is that you've promised to be able to do. And if they're ultimately impressed with the work that you provided, then it's likely that things will start off. But even if it doesn't, you've then realized that that's the right formula to start doing, and then you can scale it. It doesn't mean you've got to put a lot of work in for each particular person that you're targeting, but imagine if you're doing it for one person, then 10 people, then 50 people, and then you get a 5% hit rate. That's a pretty good response rate, in truth. 5%, 5 out of 100. Yeah. And that's when the magic can start, and you can start building those relationships to a degree. Yeah,
and I think that's sort of one of the almost the harsh truths. So I think LinkedIn has been a great tool in terms of building those sort of professional relationships, reaching out to people in a way that has previously not been available. But understanding that, like you said, if you're getting 5 responses from 100 messages that you're sending out, that's pretty good. And making sure that you are putting time into making personalized messages, because I think it's very easy to send out blanket emails and sort of LinkedIn messages to anyone that comes up on your feed.
Yes.
But it's understanding that people are going to see that and quite quickly disregard it. And I think for you to be able to almost get a foot in the door, to have someone's attention and time, you've got to be able to offer something that other people aren't. And possibly that's commenting on a recent blog post, or bringing in some sort of information about the industry that's relevant at the time to sort of catch someone's eye, and actually elicit a response. I think that's really important.
Well, you just reminded me of one other thing that I think is a really underrated tool that I don't think enough people do. I've seen more people do it recently, and I talk about it in the book briefly, which is, let's just say, for example, you're capturing 3 pieces of content in the journal every day. One of the things that I stress that I think is a really straightforward thing to do is on LinkedIn every week to be able to put the top 3 pieces of content that person has read, consumed, watched, listened to as just a thing to show this is the type of industry stuff that I'm listening to. And then what you do is you tag and link to all the different authors of that piece. So it might be that, you've written something or I've written something and someone says, great work, Tom, on that piece that you've done this week. And it was all about these 3 topics. How about you do that every week? And instead of actually fundamentally reaching out to anybody, somebody, I'm positive, who has written that piece will write in a comment, thanks so much for mentioning me. So sometimes there are active and passive ways of doing the same thing. And sometimes the passive ways can be actually a lot more, firstly, fulfilling because you're saying positive things about somebody. And secondly, it's always better to start the relationship off with actually not saying that you want anything. And so imagine doing that thing on a weekly basis, just 3 pieces of content that I've consumed that week, one from this person, tag, one from this person, tag, and they said these interesting things. Not only will it probably be good for your knowledge building exercise anyway, which you're doing anyway, as it would be, but you slowly start to build up a bigger network, because it might even be that person then follows you on LinkedIn, and then you're able to then message them and say, oh, thanks so much for following me. And then you can understand where you get to. You start that thing. Again, you can't see beyond the opportunity that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And a simple thing that happened to me was, David Kirk, when he was one of the guys I interviewed for the book, it came around because he watched my Google talk because his sister worked at Google, and then wrote a pretty big blog post on LinkedIn about why he really liked my Google talk. Mm-hmm. He didn't ask me for a meeting. He didn't ask me for anything. I was the one that came back to him because he wrote it so nicely. I almost felt embarrassed not to respond. So I just said, thank you so much, David, for, really kind thing. This obviously would have taken a lot of time to think about, watching it, thinking about it and saying something articulate. And then I was like, should we go and have a chat at some point? So sometimes that passive approach to being able to build relationships, but also demonstrate knowledge and capacity and capability can work as well as the sort of direct stuff.
Yeah, and I think it touches on sort of moving away from those transactional relationships, because especially if you're starting out in the industry, you're not hoping to be there for 1 or 2 years. You're looking to establish yourself in a career that hopefully will last decades. Mm. And it is about those relationships that grow over time. You build rapport, and further down the line, you don't know what that's going to look like. But sort of doing that groundwork and really building the foundations of that sort of mutually beneficial relationship in terms of one which is transactional. And I think that all stems from the process of how you sort of begin building those connections.
Yep.
Yeah.
Should we talk? Oh, go on. You keep going. I was going to say talk about conference stuff.
I was about to move on to that now.
Let me start. No, you're going to start. You start.
Okay, I'll start. So touching back on how we first met each other in person. It was at a sports agent and a business networking event. So I mean, these are great as someone who's new to the industry to be in person with like-minded people. I think as much as it was great to meet yourself and the other speakers at the event, it was great to mix with people who are in similar positions, who are starting out, and being able to share experiences there and sort of develop and sort of grow together. How important do you think events like that are, and how good are they for people trying to make a way in an industry?
So let me tell you the first thing, which is I hated conferences for so long. It was horrible. And so an ode almost to the conferences for me to write a section about actually how I developed a few processes to try and make them more palatable for me in truth. But a few things happen. The first time when you go to conferences as students or otherwise, and I was trying to go to loads of sports and football and law conferences and the rest of it, is no one knows you. You don't know anybody. It's the most awkward thing to try and start conversations with people that you don't know, and you end up sort of either in a corner pretending you're busy doing something, or you're just, milling around hoping that you're going to catch someone's eye, that they don't mind then having a chat with you. And then if you were to be in the position of then having a chat with someone, you literally want to hold on to them for dear life, because you're thinking, I just got to keep talking to this person, because what happens when they finish and want to go somewhere else? Then I'm gonna have to have the same process go all over again.
Yeah.
But then what happens is it's a mindset practice thing. It also helps as well as you get more senior, you get to know more people, so you can have conversations with people, and it feels a little bit more authentic and a little bit more natural and less transactional, that type of stuff. But what I tried to think about were the things that would be useful for me when I was starting out in the industry that wouldn't put me off going to these conferences all the time. So simple things that, out of insecurity I developed, like sticking around the teas and coffee area, literally sticking around there and being quite hyped up on caffeine after a while if you keep on drinking too much coffee. But then just someone then putting some sugar in their coffee next to them and saying, oh, hi, how are you enjoying the conference? No one's going to blank you. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean you have to stick around with them for ages. It just means a 5-minute or a 2-minute. And if you just times that by 3, and you feel like you've spoken to 3 people in the conference, you feel like you've won. Like just generally, and then you'll try and find that person on LinkedIn if they give you your card or whatever else it might be. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that happens a lot of the time is hopefully the conference will be in relation to some talks or some networking things or whatever else it might be. And usually you'll be sitting down next to somebody. The thing I would recommend the most when you sit down next to somebody is not leave it 2 minutes before you look one way. Because it's awkward. You've sat down, you've looked one way or the other, and you still haven't spoken to them at a networking event, at a conference thing that you're supposed to speak to people at. So the thing that's really important to do, and I'm guilty of it still, sometimes if I'm just on an email or I'm doing something, is just turn one way and say, hi, how are you enjoying the conference today? Oh, I'm Daniel, I'm doing it. And it just breaks the ice so easily. And then you never know when you're going to see that person out in the foyer afterwards to have a chat and all of those type of things.
Yeah, and I think one of the most daunting things can be, especially early on, is thinking, what do you have to talk about? What do you have to offer? But it can be as simple as asking someone how their day is going, if they've found anyone interesting at the conference. I think building those relationships through introductions like that, especially in those environments, it just builds your confidence and it makes the next step so much easier.
Just open-ended questions is key. It's that listening bit as well. I think it's really important not to feel like you've got a verbal diarrhea, that it's all coming out. It's literally like you're just talking at somebody because of all the nervous, anxious energy that you've had from the day so far. So I think it's all of those. What you're looking forward to hearing, what area of the profession are you in, how did you get into it, or just open-ended questions about the other person. And if you can just develop those 3 or 4 stock responses, you're never going to go wrong as a first indicator, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think it's also an interesting point that when you're actually at the events, there are these sort of almost steps that you can have to get yourself involved, but there's a lot of work that you can do in preparation for an event to make the process much easier, so that you can get as much value out of the event as possible, even if it is your first time attending something like that.
Tell me also, I mean, you've read parts of it on that. What did you think were the useful sort of preparation steps that ended up being quite productive for you?
So I think one of the key things, looking back to my experiences of the conference where we first met each other, was going through the attendee list beforehand. So effectively about a week before the conference, a list was sent out with everyone that was attending, and it was quite easy to go to LinkedIn. Most people had profiles, and just connect with people, learn a bit more about who's going to be there, and sort of almost envision what the environment's going to be like.
Yep.
So I think it was probably quite annoying to everyone there that I think I'd reached out to them, just sort of introducing myself. And then it made initial introductions so much easier, because being in that conference room, beginning a conversation with someone, And if it's someone that you've had a brief exchange with, even if it's as simple as, hi, my name's Tom, a week before, it just makes those sort of the next steps much easier. And I remember a couple of people sort of coming up to me and saying, hi, you're Tom, you messaged me last week.
Great.
And it felt quite weird at the time. And I didn't really know where to go from there, but it just made that sort of initial step much easier and much more comfortable, being in that environment that can be quite intimidating.
I also think on that particular conference that Urquhart and I were running, we were really quite insistent that, hopefully in a positive way, that the couple of days there was an opportunity just for everybody to chat in truth as much as possible. So there wasn't any VIP bit, it was all just, everyone was there to be able to chat to each other and to be able to make the most of the couple of days. And the idea was to make it a quite inclusive environment that everybody could have those conversations and feel that they were an equal part of the chat, I think, generally.
Yeah, I think possibly something that I'm not sure if you guys will be aware of, but there was a sort of a chat for attendees that was set up that day, which is still extremely active.
Really?
Yeah, even now. So
is that a WhatsApp chat or what?
Yeah, so there's a WhatsApp chat and a LinkedIn group as well.
Yes.
But the WhatsApp chat, especially with the agent regulations, and with a lot of people being very invested and interested in the agent's exam that's going to be coming up, there's been loads of exchange on that chat.
Brilliant.
So I think it speaks to what you guys were trying to create at that event, which is almost a community where the participants were as involved there as the speakers. And I think it meant that those relationships and sort of the longevity of the event is actually providing a lot of value even 5-6 months down the line now.
Better give them a discount code for the book.
Yeah, we got to sort that out.
Really good. That's actually really fascinating to know, and I didn't know that. So that's always a good sign of a couple of good days. Well done.
I think there's probably 40-50 people in the chat.
Well, it makes me think actually now for the next time, what we actually need to do is set up a business account for the Fabs conference and actually have everybody into that chat over 2 days, and then that can be a good legacy conversation for everybody to be able to have. So I think WhatsApp is a different platform, obviously, to LinkedIn to a degree, where everyone's always on WhatsApp and everybody can see, or they can silence it, or clear chat or whatever else it might be. But yeah, LinkedIn is obviously very different to WhatsApp, is different to Twitter, is different to TikTok, is different to better than I on how best to communicate. So
yeah, I think especially just going back to that point there in terms of what active steps you can take in preparation for a networking event. I think that one of the great things that LinkedIn provided was you get a bit of an insight and introduction to where people are at. And one of the things which, again, touching on the fact that we're probably slightly obsessive with some of these topics, is before the event I'd been able to go through all the attendees, know who was in what areas and who I was wanting to speak to. So it meant that leading up to the event, I had a list of people that I really wanted to catch up with. And although at the end, looking back, I didn't manage to chat with everyone, didn't manage to meet everyone, it certainly gave a bit more direction and focus to sort of how I approach the day. And I think it's a really useful tool that I know you touch on in the book, but it's something that can actually be put into practice to make that much easier.
It's good actually, because I was really unsure about whether to add that bit into the book or not. That was the bit that was probably coming out. In truth, I didn't feel it was actually that useful. Okay. But it probably wasn't useful for me now, but it's very hopefully useful. It's been obviously useful for you and others, but I felt it was slightly away from the core areas of the sort of book, even though actually it well, thank goodness it's still in. Yeah,
definitely. And then again, just one other point from my experience of networking events, I think we've touched on that fear factor, how at times it can you can almost develop that imposter syndrome of thinking that you're out of place there. But knowing sort of a couple of sentences to get yourself into a conversation, because one of the most common questions is sort of, who are you, what do you do? And I think at times if you're not prepared, you can verbal diarrhea comes out. You just start saying anything that comes to mind and you don't really come across as well as you can. So I think one of the other things which I probably did beforehand for Fabs was have a couple of sentences to introduce yourself. Again, something you touched on in the book is bringing in a couple of different things, a couple of different interests that you have, because it creates potential topics for other people to latch onto. Find that common ground, common interests, and that's how you spark a conversation.
Yeah, I can't remember the description I used of myself now in the book, but do you remember?
No, I think okay. I was reading it yesterday. I want to say a book I think you enjoyed reading.
Yeah, it was, I said football or sports lawyer, I think.
Yeah.
Reader.
Sci-fi.
Yeah, sci-fi was, and there was, maybe it was mute guitar, maybe. I used to play guitar a bit. It was something else.
Okay.
So, exactly right. The idea, therefore, being is that if you just say, "Oh, I'm Daniel, I'm a football lawyer," but you're at a fashion conference, then no one's like, okay. Well, why are you here? Type of thing. Mm-hmm. But whereas if you actually invert the conversation to be about you as a person, and then you drop in all these different hooks, okay, lawyer, book reader, sci-fi lover, music lover, whatever else it might be, love tennis or whatever, as otherwise holidays or whatever, then you give everybody, the people that you're speaking to at least, the chance to be able to take any one of those facets and to be able to run with them, which is really important. And if anybody is half decent enough in communicating, which most people are, they'll probably latch on to something, or at least will do the same back to you. So they'll mirror you sometimes and say, oh, actually, I love holidays, or I don't play tennis, but I play football, and I've done this and then all you need is the spark to get you off on any type of particular, avenue of conversation. But I think that initial bit, just to hone in, becomes really important. And also, as I go a bit older as well, I'm a little bit slower. I mean that positively, hopefully, not on the football pitch, unfortunately, but slower in terms of how deliberate I am with what I say.
Okay.
So I will be a little bit slower in terms of, I'll try and do it now, but poorly. If someone's speaking at normal speed now, I will talk that little bit slower. Deliberately, and it's awkward to even say it now a little bit, but people hang off it a tiny bit more.
Okay.
They're sort of waiting for you to come out with the thing, and being a little bit more deliberate with what you're saying actually also gives your brain a little bit more time to do what it needs to do actually as well.
Yeah, and I think as well, sort of at the event when sort of in the break, so I think we had a break at lunch, and then possibly a coffee break in the afternoon, and then at the end of the event as well. I think you just had sort of crowds of people around you, and I think one of the things that you guys were conscious of was making sure that the participant attendee list wasn't too long, because you wanted to facilitate those personal connections.
Yep.
But I think ultimately, when someone like myself approaches an expert such as yourself, Urquhart, it can be quite daunting. And again, knowing that you have something which is sort of concise, that you've processed, and taking your time to sort of construct what you're going to say, is a really important thing.
Yeah, and what I think is we worked quite well during the day was, you don't want to just try and have one conversation with one person. You want to try and, because sometimes the themes are all similar, is that you actually want to not have a line of people and one person at the front and everybody waiting. What you want is sort of have a C shape so everybody can hear everything that's going on. So that's what I try and say a lot of the time, even though my cues are a lot shorter than for Urquhart's, because everyone wants to talk to Urquhart. I just want everybody to hear everything, because it's not a bilateral conversation that everyone's having with each person I'm having with person A to person B. It's, we can all hear everything, and then sometimes things that are said don't have to be said again, but sometimes things linked into other people's conversations too.
Yeah, I remember with one of the sections, I think there was a Q&A to the whole group, and someone got quite specific about taxes. And I think you were saying, this conversation can go on later. Who wants to come and hear it can.
Yes.
And then, facilitating those discussions as a group.
I was thinking about then, I actually haven't asked too many people about their maybe top 3 takeaways from the book. So you can be the first. So let me know any thoughts that you had, hopefully positive, on the book, and things that maybe resonated with you the most. Yeah,
so I think that's a good way to look at it, thinking which points have resonated. I think going throughout, there are a lot of pieces of content that you talk about, which certainly promote discussion and thought and looking at possibly interpreting things in different ways. I think firstly, one of the things is how you talk about flipping the conversation. So like we've mentioned, the importance of relationship building can't really be overstated in these sort of situations. And I think understanding that you're approaching this for a long-term gain, and understanding that for you to be able to have someone want to engage with you, want to work with you, or just spend time with you, you've got to know what they want. So when approaching a conversation or a new person that you're wanting to communicate with, flipping the conversation, thinking how you can help them. I think especially reaching out, we've discussed this in quite a bit of detail today. People are often quite time poor. So it's got to be very easy for them to say yes to your request.
Yep.
And like you mentioned, it comes from understanding what someone wants. And I think this speaks to a much bigger point about sort of communication in general, and sort of the way that we build those relationships. Secondly, I think that, again, one of the points that I think when I first read it, it sort of hit me quite hard, is understanding that you're not going to be perfect all of the time. Knowing that on days where you're not sticking to almost the workloads that you're wanting to, that's fine. It's not to be too harsh on yourself, and to know that the important thing is more so how you react in those situations, how you get back to it the next day, and sort of in those situations adapt. And again, I think we've talked about it in this setting in terms of reading content, possibly reaching out to people, but it's across all areas of life almost, and what you're doing. I think that's probably the second point. And then finally, the act of beginning. I think, again, we've discussed it. It's quite easy to get worked out and internalize frustrations when you don't know what the next step's going to be. And it can be quite daunting and intimidating when you don't know how things are gonna turn out. But it's just understanding that to get any feedback, you've just got to put something out there. It might not be perfectly polished. You can do it to the best of your abilities, but knowing that the act of beginning is really the most important step. I think that's probably my top three.
That may make the TikTok million hit list for sure. Good stuff.
Well, we'll find out.
Correct. Brilliant.
Great.
Thanks very much for listening and or watching to this chat I had with Tom on my Build the Invisible book. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to follow me on all of my social channels. You can also contact me on danielgeey.com. Thanks again.